Nobody had entered the mansion for years. But when a lonely veteran opened the forgotten doors, his German shepherd discovered that someone had been waiting for him all along. Caleb Anderson never expected a house to change the direction of his life. After decades of service as a United States Marine, he had learned how to handle uncertainty, but he never learned how to live without a mission. The military had given him purpose, structure, and people to protect. When he returned to civilian life, the quiet became the hardest part. The mornings were slower. The days felt longer. And for the first time in years, Caleb had no one asking him where he needed to be or who needed his help. That was when he found the mansion. It sat on a wide piece of land outside a small Arizona town, surrounded by desert grass, old trees, and a silence that seemed to stretch for miles. The property had been abandoned for years. The locals called it a forgotten place. Some said the owner disappeared without explanation. Others said the mansion was simply a reminder of a different time. But Caleb saw something different. He saw a place that still had a story. Standing beside him was Bear, his 5-year-old German shepherd. The dog looked across the property with calm attention, his ears moving slightly as the wind passed through the empty fields. Bear had been with Caleb through some of the hardest transitions of his life. He was not just a companion. He was the one constant that remained when everything else changed. The first time Caleb stepped through the front doors of the mansion, he expected dust and empty rooms. Instead, he found something that felt almost frozen in time. The large entrance hall still held old furniture covered with protective sheets. Family photographs remained on the walls. A grand staircase curved upward toward the second floor. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt like someone had simply stepped away and planned to return. As Caleb walked deeper inside, he discovered the most unusual part of the property. Behind the mansion was a large private hangar. Inside were 2 old aircraft covered carefully beneath protective fabric. Nearby sat 11 classic cars arranged in perfect rows, each one carrying decades of memories. Caleb stood quietly, looking at the collection. It was not the value that caught his attention. It was the question behind it. Why would someone leave everything behind? Why would a person walk away from a place filled with so much history? Bear slowly moved between the vehicles, sniffing the ground and examining the corners of the building. Caleb watched his companion carefully. The German shepherd was not acting afraid. He was simply noticing details. That evening, Caleb sat on the mansion's old front porch while the sun disappeared behind the Arizona landscape. For the first time in a long while, the quiet did not feel empty. It felt peaceful. Bear rested beside him, watching the property with gentle focus. Caleb looked back at the mansion and wondered about the person who once called this place home. There were no answers yet, only questions. Who owned these planes? Why were these cars left untouched? And why did this forgotten mansion feel like it had been waiting for someone like him? The next morning, Caleb began exploring the property more carefully. He opened old rooms, checked storage areas, and looked through forgotten corners. Most places revealed nothing unusual, but Bear kept returning to one location near the back of the hangar, a section of the wall covered with old shelves and faded tools. Caleb moved closer and noticed something strange. Behind the dust and years of neglect, there was a small space that did not match the rest of the building. Bear sat beside it and looked at Caleb. The veteran smiled softly. "You found something, didn't you?" For the first time since arriving, Caleb felt certain of one thing. The mansion was not just holding old memories. It was hiding a story, and his German shepherd had just found the first page. The hidden space behind the old shelves was only a few inches wide, but to Caleb Anderson, it felt like he had just discovered a doorway into the past. The morning sun entered through the hangar windows, revealing the dust floating in the quiet air. Bear stood beside him, watching carefully as Caleb moved the shelves away from the wall. The German shepherd had not found something valuable. He had found something forgotten. Behind the shelves was a narrow wooden panel with a small metal handle. Caleb reached forward and pulled gently. The panel opened without resistance, revealing a small room hidden inside the hangar. There were no expensive items waiting inside. No treasure. No secret collection. Instead, there were boxes filled with memories. Caleb stepped inside slowly. The room smelled like old paper, leather, and time. A single desk sat against the wall. On top of it was a notebook, a few photographs, and a set of keys carefully placed in a small wooden tray. Bear followed quietly, his paws moving across the floor as if he understood the importance of the moment. Caleb picked up the notebook and opened the first page. A name was written there. Thomas Whitaker. The name meant nothing to Caleb at first, but the words that followed immediately caught his attention. Thomas had written about the mansion, the hangar, and the vehicles that surrounded it. But the journal was not about wealth. It was about memories. Each entry described a moment from his life. The first flight he ever took. The first car he restored with his father. The people who visited the mansion and the conversations they shared around the dinner table. Caleb turned each page carefully. The more he read, the clearer it became that Thomas was not someone who collected things because of their price. He collected them because they carried stories. One entry described the reason behind the two airplanes. Thomas wrote that one represented dreams from his youth, while the other represented gratitude for the people who helped him reach those dreams. The 11 cars had their own stories too. Each vehicle was connected to a person, a memory, or a moment that changed his life. Caleb looked back at the hangar through the open doorway. For the first time, he stopped seeing the planes and cars as abandoned possessions. He saw them as pieces of someone's journey. Later that afternoon, Caleb visited the small town nearby and asked about Thomas Whitaker. At first, people seemed surprised that someone was asking about him again. An older man, named Robert Hayes, remembered Thomas clearly. He was different, Robert said. People thought he loved those machines. But really, he loved the stories connected to them. Caleb listened carefully. Robert explained that Thomas had once been known throughout the community for helping others. He supported local programs, helped young people learn new skills, and often invited veterans to spend time at the mansion. That detail stayed with Caleb. As a veteran himself, he understood the importance of having a place where people felt they belonged. When Caleb returned to the mansion, Bear was waiting near the hangar door. The German shepherd walked inside and stopped beside another section of the wall. Caleb followed his gaze. There was another area that looked different, another place where time had hidden something away. Before exploring further, Caleb returned to the notebook. Near the final pages, he found a sentence written in Thomas's handwriting. The machines are only the beginning. The real story belongs to the people who stood beside them. Caleb read the sentence twice. He understood now that the mansion was not hiding objects. It was hiding connections. That night, Caleb sat in the old living room with Bear beside him. The veteran looked around at the forgotten photographs and quiet rooms. When he first arrived, he thought he had discovered an abandoned property. Now he knew he had discovered a piece of someone's life. But one question remained. Why had Thomas left everything behind? And why did the final pages of the journal mention someone who had not arrived yet? The second hidden space behind the hangar wall remained on Caleb Anderson's mind all night. The mansion was quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. Every room seemed to hold a message, and every discovery brought him closer to understanding the man who had left everything behind. The next morning, Caleb returned to the hangar with Bear walking beside him. The German shepherd moved calmly through the old building, occasionally stopping to observe small details. Caleb had learned something important about his companion. Bear never rushed towards something without reason. He simply noticed what others missed. The hidden section of the wall opened with a little effort. Behind it was another small room, but this one felt different. The first hidden room contained memories of Thomas Whitaker's life. This one contained pieces of the people who had been part of it. Shelves lined the walls, filled with folders, photographs, and handwritten notes. Caleb picked up the first folder and discovered dozens of names. Each name belonged to someone who had visited the mansion over the years. Veterans, neighbors, young people learning new skills, families who needed support. Thomas had documented their stories with incredible care. Caleb sat at the old desk and began reading. One note described a young veteran who arrived at the mansion after struggling to find direction after leaving the military. Thomas invited him to work on one of the classic cars, not because the car needed repairs, but because the man needed a reason to feel useful again. Another story described a teenager who learned to repair engines in the hangar and later became a mechanic. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Thomas was not building a collection. He was building connections. Caleb looked around the room and felt something he had not expected. A familiar feeling. The feeling of purpose. For years, he had believed that serving others was something connected only to his time in uniform. But Thomas had proven otherwise. Service could happen anywhere. It could happen in a workshop, around a dinner table, inside a forgotten mansion in the middle of the desert. Later that afternoon, Caleb found an old photograph tucked inside one of the folders. It showed Thomas standing beside a group of veterans near the hangar. In the corner of the picture was a small note written by Thomas. "Everyone deserves a place where they can start again." Caleb stared at the words for a long moment. He understood them more than he wanted to admit. After leaving the Marines, he had spent years searching for what came next. He had focused on what he had lost instead of what he still had to give. Bear quietly rested beside him, as if reminding him that he was not finished. That evening, Caleb decided to search the mansion's records more carefully. He wanted to understand why Thomas left so suddenly and why the property had remained untouched for so long. In the library, he found old newspapers and community records. The articles described Thomas as a successful businessman, but they focused more on his generosity than his achievements. One article mentioned that Thomas disappeared from public life after a personal loss. However, no details were ever shared. The mystery surrounding him remained. As Caleb continued searching, he discovered a small envelope hidden inside one of the bookshelves. The envelope was addressed to someone named the next caretaker. Caleb held it carefully. He had no idea who Thomas expected to find these words, but something about the message felt personal. Inside was a short letter. Thomas wrote that the mansion, the vehicles, and the memories inside were never meant to belong to one person forever. They were meant to continue helping others. He wrote that the right person would not see the property as an opportunity to own something valuable. They would see it as an opportunity to protect something meaningful. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. The meaning was becoming clearer. Thomas had not been waiting for someone wealthy. He had been waiting for someone who understood responsibility. Someone who knew what it meant to serve. Bear suddenly turned toward the hallway outside the library. His ears lifted slightly. Caleb looked in the same direction. There was no sound, no movement, only the quiet presence of the old mansion. But Bear walked forward and stopped beside another closed door. A door Caleb had not noticed before. And behind that door, another part of Thomas Whitaker's story was waiting to be discovered. The old wooden door at the end of the hallway had been hidden behind years of dust and forgotten memories. Caleb Anderson stood in front of it with Bear beside him, feeling the weight of the moment. The mansion had already revealed more than he expected, but something about this door felt different. It was not just another hidden space. It felt like an invitation. Caleb reached for the handle and opened it slowly. Inside was a small office filled with sunlight from a narrow window covered by layers of dust. Unlike the other rooms, this place looked organized. A desk sat in the center, surrounded by shelves of carefully labeled documents. There were no signs of neglect. It looked as if Thomas Whitaker had prepared this room for someone to find one day. Bear stepped inside first and quietly looked around. Caleb followed, noticing a framed photograph sitting on the desk. It showed Thomas standing beside a group of people outside the mansion. Behind them were the same planes and cars Caleb had discovered in the hangar. But this picture was different. Everyone in it was smiling. They were not looking at machines. They were looking at each other. Caleb picked up the photograph and turned it over. On the back, Thomas had written a simple sentence. "The things we build matter less than the people we build them for." Caleb read the words carefully. They felt familiar. They sounded like something a person who understood service would write. Someone who knew that a life was measured by the people helped along the way. As Caleb searched the office, he found more records about Thomas's work. There were plans for community events, notes about veteran gatherings, and letters from people who had once visited the mansion. Every letter shared the same message. Thomas had created a place where people could feel useful again. He had created a place where forgotten people could remember their own value. One letter caught Caleb's attention. It was written by a former Marine who had visited the mansion years earlier. The man described arriving at the property feeling lost after leaving the military. He wrote that Thomas never asked him about his struggles. Instead, Thomas asked him what he wanted to build next. That question changed everything. Caleb paused after reading those words. He looked toward Bear, who was resting near the doorway. The German shepherd had been with him through his own transition, through quiet mornings and uncertain days. Caleb realized that maybe he and Thomas shared more than he first understood. Both had spent their lives protecting something. Both had learned that people needed more than instructions. They needed hope. As the afternoon light moved across the office floor, Caleb discovered a small wooden box inside one of the desk drawers. It contained several old keys, a handwritten map of the property, and a note with a date from 20 years earlier. The note explained that Thomas had planned to preserve the mansion as a place where future generations could learn, create, and connect. But something unexpected happened before he could complete his plans. The project stopped. The doors closed, and the mansion slowly became forgotten. Caleb studied the map. Several areas were marked with handwritten notes. One area near the back of the property was circled more than once. The words beside it were simple: where the final story begins. Caleb felt a quiet curiosity growing inside him. Every discovery brought more questions, but it also brought a clearer understanding of Thomas. This was not a mystery built around secrets. It was a story built around meaning. That evening, Caleb walked outside with Bear and looked across the wide property. The two airplanes rested quietly in the hangar. The classic cars waited beneath layers of time. The mansion stood behind them, carrying decades of memories. For the first time since arriving, Caleb no longer felt like a visitor. He felt responsible for protecting what had been left behind. The next morning, he would follow the map. He would search the final marked location. And somewhere on that forgotten land, he believed he would finally understand why Thomas Whitaker had left everything behind for someone he had never met. The morning arrived quietly over the Arizona desert, carrying a soft breeze across the wide property that Caleb Anderson now felt connected to. The mansion no longer looked like an abandoned place. It looked like a story waiting to be understood. With the old map from Thomas Whitaker's office folded carefully in his pocket, Caleb walked toward the back of the property with Bear beside him. The German shepherd moved slowly through the grass, following the path with the same calm attention he had shown since the beginning. The location marked on the map was far from the mansion, beyond the hangar and the old storage areas. It led to a small wooden structure that had almost disappeared into the landscape. The building was simple, with faded paint and a roof that had survived decades of changing seasons. Caleb opened the door and found a room unlike any other place on the property. There were no machines, no expensive items, no collection waiting to be admired. There were only shelves filled with handwritten journals, old letters, and photographs. Caleb immediately understood. This was not a storage room. This was where Thomas kept the stories. He picked up the first journal and began reading. Each page revealed a different person who had passed through the mansion. A young mechanic who found confidence while restoring an old vehicle. A retired veteran who discovered friendship during weekend gatherings. A family that needed a place to reconnect after years apart. Thomas had carefully recorded every moment because he believed every person mattered. Caleb sat at the small desk inside the room and continued reading. The more he learned, the more he understood the purpose behind the mansion. The planes, the cars, and the buildings were never the center of the story. They were only tools. They created opportunities for people to come together. They gave people a reason to share their experiences and remember that they were not alone. Bear rested near Caleb's feet while he read. The veteran gently placed a hand on the dog's back and smiled. For years, he had searched for a new purpose after leaving the Marines. He had believed his most meaningful days were behind him. But standing inside Thomas's forgotten room, he felt something changing. Maybe purpose was not something that disappeared. Maybe it was something that waited until someone was ready to recognize it. Near the bottom shelf, Caleb found a sealed envelope with his own name written on it. He froze for a moment. The sight felt impossible. Thomas had passed away years earlier. They had never met. Yet somehow, this letter had been prepared for him. Caleb opened it carefully. Inside was a message from Thomas. The words were simple. Thomas explained that he did not know who would eventually find the mansion, but he hoped it would be someone who understood responsibility. Someone who knew that a place like this was not meant to be owned. It was meant to be cared for. Thomas wrote that he had spent his life collecting reminders of human connection. The aircraft represented dreams. The cars represented journeys. The mansion represented a place where people could gather and begin again. But the true legacy was the kindness shared inside those walls. Caleb read the final lines several times. Thomas wrote that the next caretaker would not be the person with the most money or the biggest plans. It would be the person who looked at forgotten things and saw value instead of abandonment. Caleb lowered the letter and looked around the small room. For the first time, he understood why the mansion had remained untouched for so long. It was waiting for someone who would protect its meaning. Someone who would understand that memories were not meant to be locked away. That evening, Caleb returned to the main house with Bear walking beside him. The veteran looked back at the property as the sunset painted the sky with warm colors. He thought about Thomas, about all the lives connected to this place, and about the responsibility now resting in his hands. But one question remained. The letter explained why the mansion mattered. It explained why Thomas built everything he did. Yet there was still one final mystery hidden inside the property. A small note at the bottom of the map pointed toward the hangar and carried only 4 words. The collection has a purpose. The 4 words written at the bottom of the map stayed in Caleb Anderson's mind long after the sun disappeared behind the desert hills. The collection has a purpose. He repeated the sentence quietly as he sat on the porch with Bear beside him. The mansion was peaceful, but Caleb knew there was still something waiting to be understood. The next morning, he returned to the hangar with the old map in his hand. The 2 aircraft stood quietly beneath their protective covers, and the 11 classic cars remained exactly where Thomas Whitaker had left them. For the first time, Caleb looked at them differently. He was no longer searching for a hidden secret. He was searching for the meaning behind everything Thomas had preserved. Bear walked between the vehicles, stopping occasionally near different cars. Caleb followed his companion slowly, paying attention to the details around him. Near the back corner of the hangar, Bear stopped beside an old workbench. On top of it was a small metal box covered with dust. Caleb opened it carefully and found a collection of handwritten cards. Each card had a date, a name, and a short message. At first, they looked like simple notes. But as Caleb read them, he realized they were much more. They were reminders of the people who had been changed by Thomas's kindness. One card described a young man who learned confidence while restoring an old vehicle. Another described a veteran who found friendship during quiet evenings at the mansion. Each note represented someone who had walked through the property and left with a different view of themselves. Caleb looked across the hangar. The cars were not just classic vehicles. The airplanes were not just machines. They were places where people had found reasons to believe in themselves again. Thomas had never collected objects. He had collected moments. Later that day, Caleb carefully examined the 2 airplanes. Inside one of them, he found an old flight log. The pages contained dates and names, but the most interesting part was not the flights themselves. It was the notes written beside them. Thomas had recorded who was present, what they talked about, and why that day mattered. One entry mentioned a group of veterans who gathered at the mansion after feeling disconnected from their old lives. Thomas wrote that the sound of an engine starting again reminded them that new beginnings were possible. Caleb closed the log and looked toward Bear. The German shepherd sat quietly nearby, watching him. The veteran understood something in that moment. The mansion had never been about the past. It had always been about helping people move forward. That evening, Caleb searched the hangar one more time. Behind a row of old tools, he discovered a small wooden cabinet attached to the wall. Inside was a collection of keys, each labeled with a different name. There were keys for rooms, storage areas, and vehicles. But one key was different. It had no label. Attached to it was a small piece of paper with a handwritten message from Thomas. For the person who understands. Caleb held the key in his hand and felt the weight of the words. Thomas had not known who would find it. He had not known their name, their background, or their story. But he had believed that the right person would recognize the responsibility. That night, Caleb placed the key on the table in the mansion's living room. He looked around at the old photographs, the quiet walls, and the memories that filled every corner. He thought about the years he spent serving others and the years he spent wondering what came next. Now he understood. Maybe his journey had not ended when he left the Marines. Maybe it had simply changed direction. Bear rested beside him, and Caleb smiled. The German shepherd had led him to the first clue, but the mansion had given him something much greater. It had given him a purpose. The following morning, Caleb would discover what the unlabeled key opened. And deep inside the old property, another part of Thomas Whitaker's story was waiting to be revealed. The unlabeled key rested on the wooden table in the mansion's living room, surrounded by old photographs and handwritten notes from a life Caleb Anderson was only beginning to understand. The veteran looked at it for a long moment before reaching for it. There was something different about this key. It was not just another piece of Thomas Whitaker's collection. It felt like a final invitation. Bear watched quietly from beside the fireplace, his eyes following Caleb as he stood and walked toward the back hallway. The German shepherd had been right every time before. He never forced Caleb forward. He simply noticed the path waiting ahead. The map from Thomas's office showed one final location near the far side of the property, a place Caleb had not explored yet. As the morning light spread across the desert, Caleb and Bear walked toward an old stone building hidden behind a line of trees. Unlike the mansion and the hangar, this structure looked completely forgotten. Vines covered the outside walls, and the wooden door had faded from years beneath the sun. Caleb held the key and slowly placed it into the lock. It turned easily. Inside, he discovered a room filled with shelves, boxes, and carefully organized records. But this time, there were no photographs of machines or collections. There were records of people. Hundreds of names filled the shelves. Caleb picked up the nearest folder and opened it. Inside were stories of individuals who had visited the mansion over the years. People who arrived carrying uncertainty and left with confidence. People who needed a reminder that their lives still had meaning. Thomas had written about every person with the same respect. He never described them by their problems. He described them by their potential. Caleb continued reading until he found a familiar theme. Many of the visitors were veterans. Men and women who had served their country and later struggled to find their place in civilian life. Thomas had created a quiet place where they could learn, work, and reconnect. He understood something Caleb had slowly begun to understand himself. A person does not stop being valuable when one chapter ends. Sometimes they simply need a new place to begin the next one. Near the back of the room, Caleb found a large notebook with a title written on the cover. The next chapter. He opened it carefully. The first pages contained Thomas's thoughts about the future of the mansion. He wrote that every generation has a responsibility to protect the lessons of the previous one. He wrote that buildings eventually age, machines eventually stop working, and possessions eventually lose their shine. But kindness could continue forever if someone chose to carry it forward. Caleb paused while reading those words. He thought about his own journey. For years, he believed his greatest contribution was behind him. He believed his time serving others had ended when he removed his uniform for the last time. But standing inside that hidden room, surrounded by Thomas's words, he realized something important. Service was never about a title or a place. It was about choosing to help when there was a need. Bear walked closer and rested beside Caleb. The veteran placed his hand gently on the dog's shoulder. He smiled because, somehow, the German shepherd had brought him to a place where he finally understood himself again. At the bottom of the notebook, Caleb found one final message from Thomas. The person who finds this room must decide what happens next. Caleb read the sentence twice. Thomas had not left instructions. He had left a choice. Outside, the mansion stood quietly under the Arizona sky. The planes waited inside the hangar. The classic cars remained surrounded by memories. Everything Thomas built was still there, but now Caleb understood the true responsibility. He was not meant to preserve old things. He was meant to preserve what those things represented. That evening, Caleb returned to the porch with Bear beside him. The veteran looked across the property and felt something he had not felt in years. Not a duty forced upon him. Not an obligation. A calling. But before he could make any decision about the future, there was one more discovery waiting inside Thomas's final records. A document that would reveal why the mansion had been left untouched for so long, and why Thomas believed the right person would eventually find it. The document hidden among Thomas Whitaker's final records was not a legal paper or a list of instructions. It was a letter written years earlier, placed carefully inside a folder marked with a single word, tomorrow. Caleb Anderson sat at the small desk in the hidden room and unfolded the paper while Bear rested quietly nearby. The morning light entered through the window, touching the old pages that had been protected for decades. Caleb began reading, and with every sentence, the mystery of the mansion became clearer. Thomas explained that he knew one day the property might become forgotten. He knew the planes would become covered, the cars would become silent, and the rooms that once held conversations would eventually become empty. But he believed that places built with kindness could survive if someone understood their purpose. Thomas wrote that he never wanted the mansion to become a monument to himself. He wanted it to remain a place where people could find direction when life became uncertain. Caleb slowly lowered the letter. He looked around the room and thought about everything he had discovered since arriving. At first, he believed he had found an abandoned property filled with unusual belongings. Now he understood that he had found a collection of human stories. Every vehicle, every photograph, and every room represented someone who had needed a second chance. Bear stood and walked toward a shelf near the corner of the room. The German Shepherd looked at a small wooden box that Caleb had not noticed before. Inside were several final notes from Thomas. Each note was addressed to different people who had visited the mansion throughout the years. One was for a young mechanic. Another was for a former service member. Another was for someone who simply needed a place to feel welcome. Caleb read them one by one. Thomas had never focused on what people lacked. He focused on what they could become. That lesson stayed with Caleb. After leaving the Marines, he had spent years wondering what purpose remained for him. He thought his most meaningful moments belonged to the past. But Thomas's words showed him that purpose was not something a person earned once and then lost. It was something they chose every day. Later that afternoon, Caleb walked back through the mansion with Bear beside him. He noticed details he had ignored before. The large dining room was not just an old room. It was a place where people had shared meals and stories. The hangar was not just a building full of machines. It was a place where people had learned patience and confidence. The garage was not just a collection of classic cars. It was a place where someone could discover that their hands were still capable of creating something meaningful. As the sun began to set, Caleb returned to the porch and looked across the property. For the first time, he imagined the mansion filled with people again. He imagined veterans sitting together, neighbors sharing stories, and young visitors learning from the history around them. He realized that Thomas had not left him a responsibility to protect the past. He had left him an opportunity to build the future. The next morning, Caleb contacted the local community and shared what he had discovered. He did not talk about the value of the planes or the cars. He talked about Thomas's mission. He talked about the people whose lives had been changed inside those walls. The response surprised him. People remembered the mansion. They remembered the kindness. They remembered the man who had opened his doors when others needed support. Soon, neighbors began visiting the property, bringing old photographs, memories, and stories that had been forgotten over time. Bear became a familiar presence among them, calmly walking through the grounds and greeting everyone who arrived. Caleb watched his companion and smiled. The German Shepherd had found the first clue, but he had also helped Caleb find something much more important. He had helped him find a place where his own story could continue. Yet one final question remained. Thomas had left behind a mission, a legacy, and a home full of memories. But Caleb still needed to discover the final reason why Thomas chose this exact place to build everything. Hidden somewhere inside the mansion was one last story, and it would reveal the heart behind it all. The final story hidden inside the mansion was not written in a journal, stored in a box, or protected behind a locked door. It was written in the memories of everyone who had ever walked through the property. Caleb Anderson discovered that truth on a quiet morning when he found one last envelope inside Thomas Whitaker's old office. The envelope was simple. No special markings. No hidden instructions. Just a handwritten message that began with 3 words. For the caretaker. Caleb opened it slowly while Bear rested beside him. The German Shepherd had been there for every discovery, every question, and every moment when the past became connected to the present. Inside the letter, Thomas explained why he chose that piece of land decades earlier. He wrote that after years of success, he realized something important. A person could own many things and still feel empty, but a person could give something away and create a legacy that lasted forever. Thomas described the mansion as more than a home. It was a place where people could return when they felt lost. It was a place where veterans could remember they still had value. It was a place where neighbors could become friends and strangers could become family. Caleb read the letters several times. The words felt personal because he understood them. For years, he had believed that his purpose was connected only to his military service. He believed the most important part of his life was behind him. But Thomas's final message showed him something different. A person's mission does not always end. Sometimes it simply changes shape. Over the next several months, Caleb dedicated himself to restoring the mansion. He did not try to make it look brand new. He wanted to protect its history. The old photographs remained on the walls. The classic cars stayed where their stories could be remembered. The airplanes were carefully preserved, not as symbols of wealth, but as reminders of dreams and determination. The community slowly returned to the property. Veterans came to share their experiences. Families visited to learn about the history of the place. Young people came to work with their hands and discover skills they never knew they had. The mansion that once stood silent became alive again. Through it all, Bear remained beside Caleb. The German shepherd became a familiar presence on the property. Visitors noticed how calmly he moved through the grounds, greeting people and sitting quietly beside those who needed a peaceful moment. Caleb often thought about the first day he arrived. He remembered walking through the empty rooms and wondering why anyone would leave such a place behind. Now he understood. Thomas had never abandoned the mansion. He had trusted that someone would eventually find it and understand what it truly represented. One evening, Caleb stood outside the hangar as the sun lowered over the Arizona landscape. The two airplanes rested quietly inside. The 11 classic cars reflected the warm evening light. The mansion stood behind him, no longer forgotten. It was no longer a place filled with unanswered questions. It was a place filled with stories. Bear walked over and sat beside him. Caleb placed a hand gently on his companion and looked across the property. He thought about everything that had brought him there. The years of service, the quiet days after retirement, the decision to purchase a forgotten home, the strange discovery that began with a German shepherd noticing something everyone else ignored. He realized that the greatest discovery was never hidden behind a wall or inside a locked room. It was the understanding that every person still has something meaningful to offer. Thomas had left behind more than a mansion. He had left behind a reminder that kindness could outlive time. Caleb had arrived searching for a place to begin again. Instead, he found a reason to continue serving. And beside him was the loyal companion who helped him discover it. Some treasures are measured by their value. Others are measured by the lives they touch. And sometimes, the greatest stories are found not in what we inherit, but in what we choose to carry forward.